My name is Elena Tisana. I am 31 years old, and for my entire life, I have been treated as a decorative placeholder in the lineage of a family that measures human worth by the presence of a Y chromosome. Standing in the center of the north courtyard of our family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, a space that my father Richard spent precisely $85,000 to landscape with rare white hydrangeas and imported Italian flagstone just for this 5-hour event, I realized that I was nothing more than a failing investment to him. The air was thick with the scent of expensive catering and the salt spray of the Long Island Sound, but all I could smell was the sharp, metallic tang of betrayal. I was 7 months pregnant, my feet aching in a pair of $800 Jimmy Choo flats that were beginning to feel like lead weights, and my father was currently holding a silver-plated Sennheiser microphone, his voice echoing through the speakers hidden among the manicured boxwood hedges. He looked directly at my protruding stomach, his eyes cold and clinical, and delivered the sentence that effectively severed the umbilical cord of our relationship before my own child could even be born. He told 150 of Connecticut's elite that if this baby was a girl, I should not expect a single cent of the Tisana inheritance because our wealth only flows to male heirs. It was a calculated public execution of my dignity, delivered with the casual indifference of a man checking a stock ticker. Behind him stood my brother, Julian, the golden boy who had been failing upward since he crashed his first 2022 Porsche 911 Carrera into a stone wall at 18 and had it replaced by Monday morning. Julian was currently checking his $18,000 Rolex Submariner with an expression of bored amusement, a smirk playing on his lips that told me he had known about this public announcement for weeks. To my father and brother, women were simply vessels designed to marry into someone else's legacy, temporary custodians of a name they were never truly allowed to own. But what they did not know as I stood there, my hand instinctively protecting the life growing inside me, was that I had spent the last decade building a fortress in the shadows of their arrogance. While they were busy obsessing over legacy and male dominance, I had been the one quietly managing the back end of Tisana Logistics, the very company that funded their luxury lifestyles. They saw a quiet daughter who followed orders, but I was the one with the administrative passwords, the one who understood the offshore tax structures, and the one who had spent the last 18 months redirecting the flow of the very wealth they were currently weaponizing against me. The humiliation was visceral, a physical weight that made it hard to draw a full breath in my tight silk dress. I looked around the courtyard at the faces of my aunts, my cousins, and my father's business associates, seeing a mixture of pity and smug satisfaction. My mother, Catherine, was staring into her glass of Veuve Clicquot as if the bubbles could offer her a way out of her own complicity. But she said nothing. She had spent 30 years being the perfect Tisana wife, trading her voice for a seat at the table and a closet full of Hermes Birkin bags. I refused to let my daughter inherit that silence. The baby kicked, a sharp and sudden movement that felt like a command. In that moment, the hurt crystallized into a cold, hard diamond of resolve. I remembered the exact moment I started the deletion process, a rainy Tuesday in February when I sat in my home office in a modest 1,200 square foot apartment in New Haven that I paid for with my own salary, far away from the gilded cage of Greenwich. I had opened my MacBook Pro and accessed the secure server for the Tisana Family Trust, looking at the numbers that represented generations of greed and exclusion. The balance of the primary liquid asset account sat at $112 million, a staggering sum that my father intended to hand over to Julian, a man who couldn't even manage to show up to a board meeting on time. I remember the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in my window frame that night, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled perfection of the family estate. I began moving the pieces. I wasn't stealing, not in the traditional sense, but I was reclaiming the labor I had provided for free for years while Julian was off on ski trips in Aspen and yachting in St. Bart's. I had created a series of shell companies, each one named after a different type of wildflower, a private joke that only I would ever understand. Bluebell Holdings, Marigold Ventures, Foxglove Inc. I moved the digital keys. I shifted the power of attorney documents that my father had signed years ago without reading because he assumed I was too dull to understand them, and I prepared for the day the hammer would fall. That day was today. As my father stepped down from the podium, the crowd began to clap in a polite, muffled way that felt like dirt being thrown on a coffin. Julian walked over to me, his gait arrogant and loose, and leaned in close enough for me to smell the expensive scotch on his breath despite the early hour. He told me not to take it personally and that it was just the way things were, then patted my shoulder with a condescending hand that made my skin crawl. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I didn't make a scene. Instead, I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. I sent a single encrypted message to a contact in Zurich. The message contained a sequence of 12 digits and a final instruction: execute. Within seconds, a series of automated wire transfers were triggered, moving the final tranches of the liquid wealth into accounts that my father and brother didn't even know existed. I watched them mingle, my father shaking hands with a senator, Julian flirting with a young woman whose family owned half of the shipping industry, both of them completely unaware that they were currently standing on a hollowed-out empire. The cost of this baby shower, the $112,000 for the catering, the flowers, the security, and the silver-plated microphone would be the last thing the Tisana estate ever paid for. By tomorrow morning, their black Amex cards would be declined, their luxury vehicles would be flagged for repossession, and the mahogany doors of their world would begin to swing shut. I looked at my father one last time, seeing the wrinkles around his eyes and the pride he took in a name that was now essentially a ghost. He had spent his life building a wall to keep women out of his legacy, never realizing that he had built it so high he couldn't see me tearing down the foundation from the other side. My daughter would not be a woman who married into someone else's legacy. She would be the woman who owned the ground everyone else walked on. As I walked toward my 2024 midnight black Tesla Model S, the gravel crunching under my feet, I felt a sense of peace that no amount of inheritance could ever buy. The high-pitched whine of the electric motor was the only sound in the quiet afternoon as I drove away from the courtyard, leaving the 150 guests to finish their expensive champagne and their whispered gossip. I was 31. I was 7 months pregnant with a girl, and I had just deleted the future of the men who thought I was nothing. Family is not just a name or a bloodline, it is a covenant of respect, and once that covenant is broken, the debt must be paid in full. I had spent my life as a shadow in their sun, but shadows have a way of growing longer as the day ends, eventually swallowing everything in their path. The Tisana wealth was gone, not because of a lack of a male heir, but because of the presence of a daughter who finally knew her own worth and the exact price of her silence. I drove past the security gate, the guard nodding to me with a respect he wouldn't have shown if he knew I was no longer the heiress he thought I was. I looked in the rearview mirror at the sprawling estate, the stone chimneys and the sprawling lawns that had been my prison and my playground. It looked smaller now, a toy house for people with small minds. I thought about the $112,000 humiliation and smiled, knowing that it was the best investment I had ever made. It had given me the final push I needed to stop being a victim of their tradition and start being the architect of my own life. The road ahead was clear, the GPS on my dashboard showing the way to my new home, a place they would never find, bought with the money they told me I didn't deserve. My name is Elena Tisana, and this is the last time I will ever use that surname, because from this moment on, I belong to no one but myself and the daughter who will never have to wait for a man to give her a cent of what she is worth. The sun began to set over the Connecticut coastline, casting long orange streaks across the water, and for the first time in 31 years, I felt like I was finally heading home to a place where my name wasn't a curse or a commodity, but a promise. The weight of the world hadn't lifted, but I had finally found the strength to carry it on my own terms, leaving the ruins of a sexist dynasty in the dust of my tires. This was not the end of a story, but the beginning of a reign, one built on the ashes of their arrogance and the cold, hard reality of a bank account they could no longer touch. By the time my father realized the microphone was off and the money was gone, I would be a world away, raising a girl who would never need his permission to exist. My name is Elena Tisana, and if there is one thing I learned growing up in the shadow of a dynasty built on glass foundations, it is that in the high-stakes accounting of the Tisana family, the math was always cruelly, devastatingly simple. My brother Julian was the primary investment, and I was merely the overhead. We were raised in a sprawling 12,000-square-foot Georgian colonial in Greenwich, Connecticut, a house that smelled eternally of expensive beeswax polish and the cold ozone scent of central air conditioning. Yet for all its vastness, there was never quite enough room for me to exist as anything other than a ghost. My father, Richard Tisana, presided over Tisana Developments with the iron-fisted ego of a medieval king, managing a portfolio of commercial real estate and luxury residential projects that was valued at a staggering $92 million, a figure he quoted at dinner parties with the same frequency that other men might mention the weather. To my father, the world was a balance sheet, and from the moment Julian was born 3 years after me, I was moved into the liability column while Julian was heralded as the future of the empire, regardless of the fact that he possessed the intellectual depth of a puddle in a mid-August heatwave. The disparity between our lives was not merely a matter of preference, but a systemic erasure of my capabilities in favor of his mediocrity, a dynamic that was codified in the very architecture of our home. The most glaring example of this occurred when Julian was 18, and in a fit of drug-fueled arrogance, crashed his brand-new 2022 Porsche 911 Carrera, a machine finished in a custom guards red that cost $140,000, directly into a historic fieldstone wall just 3 miles from our driveway. He walked away with nothing but a bruised ego and a slight scratch on his forehead, but the car was a total loss, a twisted heap of German engineering and wasted potential that had to be dragged away by a flatbed truck in the middle of the night to avoid a scandal. When my father heard the news, there was no shouting, no grounded privilege, and certainly no talk of consequences. Instead, Richard poured himself a glass of 25-year-old Macallan, sighed with a fatherly indulgence that I had never once received, and dismissed the entire 6-figure catastrophe as a simple learning experience. By the following Monday, a new 2023 model in midnight black was sitting in the circular driveway, the keys handed over with a slap on the back and a reminder to watch the turns, while Julian just smirked, already planning his next weekend of debauchery in the Hamptons. Meanwhile, I was finishing my final year at the University of Chicago, having worked 3 part-time jobs in the campus library and the registrar's office to cover the living expenses that my father deemed unnecessary for a girl who should just be looking for a husband. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in finance and a minor in forensic accounting, achieving a cumulative GPA of 3.98 while navigating some of the most rigorous coursework in the country. But the celebration of my academic triumph was a masterclass in psychological belittling. When I brought my diploma home, a heavy parchment embossed with the university's gold seal and housed in a custom-made cherry wood frame that I had paid for myself, I watched as my father briefly looked at it with the same fleeting interest he might give a grocery store circular. He didn't hang it in the mahogany-walled study where he kept his collection of vintage nautical maps or in the grand foyer where Julian's participation trophies from junior varsity golf sat prominently on the mantel like holy relics of a champion. Instead, my father directed the housekeeper to hang my summa cum laude diploma in the guest bathroom on the 2nd floor, tucked behind the door so that it was only visible when the door was closed, effectively turning my highest achievement into a piece of background noise for people washing their hands. He told me that it was a nice little certificate and that it would make for good reading material for our visitors, a comment that cut deeper than any physical blow ever could because it confirmed that my intellect was, to him, nothing more than a curiosity to be hidden away. While Julian was being funneled into a vice president role at Tisana Developments with a starting salary of $250,000 plus a performance bonus he never earned, I was left to find my own way in a world that didn't care about my surname. I moved to a cramped, drafty apartment in Chicago's Logan Square neighborhood, where the radiator clanked like a dying steam engine every winter and the rent ate up nearly half of my $42,000 starting salary at a mid-sized accounting firm. I lived on a budget so tight that I knew the exact price of every generic brand of pasta at the local Aldi, and I spent my evenings studying for my CPA exams under the flickering light of a lamp I'd found at a thrift store for $12. Every month, I would receive the family newsletter, a glossy digital PDF that my mother sent out, detailing the family's expenditures and social triumphs. I would read about the $15,000 a month they spent on country club memberships at the Stanwich Club and the Round Hill Club, fees that were paid without a second thought, while I was worrying about whether I could afford to replace the worn-out soles of my only pair of professional work shoes. The contrast was staggering, a literal divide between those who were allowed to consume the world and those who were expected to serve it, and it fueled a quiet, burning resentment in my chest that became the primary engine of my existence. I watched from afar as Julian was promoted to Chief Operating Officer after only 18 months, a role that required him to do nothing more than sign documents that his assistants prepared for him, while I worked 60-hour weeks in the trenches of corporate finance, learning how to track every cent through the labyrinth of global markets. I became a master of the invisible, a specialist in the digital footprints that money leaves as it moves, and I did it all while my father and brother continued to treat me like a disappointing overhead expense that they only tolerated because of the biological accident of my birth. They viewed my distance and my independence as a sign of my failure to attract a wealthy suitor, never suspecting for a moment that I was using my access to the company's digital backend, access I had maintained since I was an intern, to build a comprehensive map of their financial vulnerabilities. I saw the invoices for Julian's private jet charters to Las Vegas, billed as business research, and I saw the $300,000 wire transfers for my father's collection of rare watches, all funneled through the company's operational accounts to avoid the scrutiny of my mother's personal spending limits. They were sloppy, bloated with the confidence of men who believe that the rules of gravity don't apply to them, and they were so blinded by their own chauvinism that they never thought to change the passwords I had helped set up when I was a teenager. To them, I was just Elena, the quiet girl who lived in a small apartment and worked a boring job, a person who would eventually come crawling back to Greenwich to ask for a handout when she realized the world was too hard. They didn't see the woman who was sitting in that small apartment with 3 monitors glowing in the dark, systematically deconstructing the very empire they thought was their birthright. I was the overhead, the ghost in their machine, and I was beginning to realize that the most dangerous thing in a house built on pride is the person who has been taught that they have nothing left to lose. Every time Julian posted a photo of himself on a yacht in St. Bart's, holding a bottle of Cristal that cost more than my monthly rent, I would add another line of code to the script I was writing, a silent digital predator designed to drain the lifeblood of Tisana Developments. Every time my father made a joke about how I was wasting my time in a cubicle when I could be hosting charity galas, I would verify another offshore routing number, ensuring that when the time came, the collapse would be total and irreversible. They had spent 31 years teaching me that I was secondary, that my value was negotiable, and that my voice didn't matter, and in doing so, they gave me the perfect cover to destroy them. I was the ghost daughter, and ghosts are famously difficult to catch until they have already taken everything they came for. The $42,000 salary was my camouflage, the guest bathroom diploma was my motivation, and the $92 million in assets was my target. And as I stood in that Connecticut courtyard years later, watching them celebrate a legacy that was already gone, I knew that the math was finally about to balance in my favor. They thought they were the architects of a dynasty, but they had forgotten that even the most grand colonial is held up by the very things they buried in the foundation. And I was the cracks that were about to bring the whole gilded structure screaming down into the dirt of their own arrogance. My name is Elena, and while most people assume that the collapse of a family begins with a grand, explosive confrontation, the truth is that for me, the end arrived with the silent digital click of a bank transfer that totaled exactly $50,000. This was not just a number on a screen. It was the educational trust fund left specifically to me by my grandmother, Eleanor, a woman who had seen the sharp, predatory edges of the Tisana men long before I was even born and had tried to build me a ladder out of their shadow. That money was my lifeline, the precisely calculated sum required to cover my tuition and living expenses for my master's in financial engineering at Columbia University, a goal I had pursued with a religious intensity for 4 years. I remember sitting in the dim light of my bedroom in our Greenwich estate, the glow of my laptop reflecting off the walls of a room that had always felt more like a waiting room than a home, and watching the refresh icon spin on my browser. When the page finally loaded, the balance didn't show the $52,400 I had been tracking for months. Instead, it showed a cold, mocking zero. There was no explanation, no notification, just a void where my entire future had been anchored. I knew immediately where the money had gone because in the Tisana household, my assets were treated as nothing more than a contingency fund for my brother Julian's catastrophic lack of impulse control. I walked down the grand mahogany staircase, my footsteps muffled by the $20,000 Persian runner, and found my father in his study, a room that smelled of old leather, expensive tobacco, and the suffocating weight of 3 generations of male ego. He was sitting behind his massive oak desk, swirling a glass of $200 Lagavulin scotch, the ice clinking against the crystal with a sound that felt like it was chipping away at my teeth. I didn't even have to ask the question before he looked up, his expression one of mild annoyance rather than guilt, as if I were a minor clerical error he had forgotten to correct. He told me quite calmly that Julian had gotten himself into a bit of a legal mess involving property damage to a historic storefront in downtown Westport and a $12,000 fine for a reckless driving charge that he had managed to escalate by insulting the arresting officer. The settlement to keep it out of the local papers and avoid a trial had cost exactly $50,000. My father didn't apologize. Instead, he took a slow, appreciative sip of his scotch and told me that Julian was the future of Tisana Developments and that the family had to protect its primary assets at all costs. He looked me dead in the eye and said that my master's degree was nothing more than a vanity project, a decorative pursuit for a girl who would inevitably just marry a provider and spend her life hosting charity luncheons anyway. The cruelty of his logic was so absolute that it bypassed my tear ducts and went straight into my marrow, freezing into a jagged, unbreakable resolve that would define the next decade of my life. He saw my education, my 3.98 GPA, and my relentless work ethic as a hobby, while he saw Julian's string of high-priced failures as the growing pains of a titan. In that moment, as the amber liquid in his glass caught the light from the green-shaded banker's lamp, I realized that I was not a daughter to him. I was an insurance policy for his son's mediocrity. I didn't scream, I didn't plead, and I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing a single drop of moisture in my eyes. I simply turned around and walked out of the room, leaving him to his expensive silence and his misplaced pride. I went upstairs to the room I had occupied since I was 5 years old and began to pack. I didn't take the designer clothes my mother had bought me to make me more presentable to the sons of his business associates. I took my textbooks, my research notes, and the few pieces of jewelry my grandmother had given me in secret. I packed 2 suitcases, rugged, scuffed Samsonites that had seen me through my undergraduate years, and I felt a strange, terrifying lightness as I zipped them shut. I left the house at 11:45 p.m., sliding behind the wheel of my aging sedan, a car my father had once called an embarrassment to the driveway but which I had maintained with my own money because it was the only thing I truly owned. I didn't leave a note because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been ignored for 24 years. I drove through the winding, tree-lined streets of Greenwich, past the guarded estates and the manicured lawns that hid so many polite horrors, and I didn't look back until I hit the interstate heading west toward Chicago. The drive was a blur of fluorescent gas station lights and the rhythmic thumping of tires over expansion joints, a 15-hour journey that felt like a slow-motion escape from a sinking ship. I remember stopping at a rest area in Ohio as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, the air cold and smelling of damp asphalt, and checking my bank account one last time. I had exactly $1,200 in my personal savings, money I had made by tutoring underclassmen and working as a research assistant. It was a pittance compared to the $50,000 my father had stolen from my future, but it was mine, and for the first time in my life, it was enough. When I arrived in Chicago, the city felt massive and indifferent, a sprawling concrete jungle that didn't care about the Tisana name or the drama of a Connecticut courtyard. I found a tiny studio apartment in a neighborhood that my father would have described as a slum, a place where the elevator smelled like stale cigarettes and the view was of a brick wall and a rusted fire escape. The rent was $1,400 a month, which meant I had to find a job within the first 72 hours, or I would be sleeping in my car. I didn't go to Columbia that fall. Instead, I took an entry-level position at a mid-market logistics firm, working in the windowless basement of their accounting department for $42,000 a year. My father sent me one email 3 weeks after I left, not asking where I was or if I was safe, but merely informing me that he had canceled my credit card and that if I wanted to come home and apologize for my dramatic exit, he might consider paying for a wedding if I found a suitable man. I didn't reply. I deleted the email and then I deleted the account, severing the last digital thread that connected me to his control. I spent the next several years living a life of absolute calculated frugality, a ghost in the machinery of a city that never sleeps. I walked to work to save the $2.50 bus fare. I lived on bags of brown rice and frozen spinach, and I spent every spare moment in the public library, using their high-speed internet to track the movements of Tisana developments. I watched from a distance as my father leveraged more and more of the family's assets to fuel Julian's increasingly desperate and ill-advised ventures into the luxury condo market. I saw the filings for new loans, the whispers in the trade journals about liquidity issues, and the frantic attempts to maintain the appearance of a flourishing empire while the foundations were being eaten away by Julian's incompetence and my father's refusal to admit he had bet on the wrong horse. They thought I was gone, a forgotten overhead expense that had finally balanced itself out by disappearing, but I was actually becoming the most dangerous version of myself. I was the person who knew exactly how they operated, where they hid their bodies, and how they manipulated the tax codes to sustain their lifestyle. I eventually finished my degree, not at Columbia, but through a grueling combination of night classes and online certifications that I paid for in installments, often skipping meals to ensure I could afford the exam fees. I became a specialist in forensic accounting, a hunter of missing money and hidden assets, and I did it with a singular, cold-blooded focus on the $50,000 that had been stolen from me. Every time I reached a new professional milestone, every time I secured a higher salary position, I didn't celebrate with a luxury purchase or a fancy dinner. I moved the extra money into an offshore account that I had carefully obscured through a series of legal loopholes that my father wasn't even aware existed. I was building my own trust fund, one that no one could drain to pay for a brother's mistake. The irony was that the very skills I used to help my corporate clients protect their wealth were the same ones I was using to dismantle the Tisana legacy. My father's words, that my degree was a vanity project, became the fuel for a fire that burned with a steady blue flame, lighting my way through the dark nights of my 20s. By the time I reached 31 and found myself back in that Connecticut courtyard for the baby shower I never wanted, I was no longer the girl who had driven away in a used car with 2 suitcases. I was a weapon that they had spent decades sharpening, a woman who understood the value of every cent because I had felt the absence of 50,000 of them like a physical wound. They still saw the ghost daughter, the one who lived in a small apartment and worked a boring job, never suspecting that the very person they were publicly humiliating was the one holding the digital detonator to their entire world. The $50,000 theft wasn't just a loss of money, it was the moment the Tisana family lost the only person who actually knew how to save them. As I stood there under the $85,000 landscaping, listening to my father's sexist decree through the silver-plated microphone, I felt a sense of grim satisfaction. He had traded my future for Julian's past, and now he was about to find out exactly how much that transaction was going to cost him in the long run. The math was finally done, the accounts were settled, and the only thing left for me to do was walk away and watch the numbers on their screens hit zero, just like mine had all those years ago in the dim light of a Greenwich bedroom. Family isn't about blood. It's about the debts you owe and the ones you refuse to pay, and as far as I was concerned, the Tisana family was officially bankrupt in every way that mattered. My name is Elena Tisana, and for the last 10 years, I have lived a double life that would have made a professional spy shudder, all to protect the secret architecture of a revenge that was designed long before I even understood the true depths of my father's depravity. While my father, Richard, preened in front of his business associates, and Julian squandered six-figure sums on vintage sports cars and hollow social status, they both operated under the arrogant assumption that they had successfully broken me, that they had pruned me from the family tree like a dead branch. They saw my move to a drafty apartment in Chicago and my $42,000 salary as a white flag of surrender, a sign that the overhead expense had finally been offloaded. What they did not know, and what their small, patriarchal minds could never have conceived, was that I was the chosen guardian of the true Tisana legacy, a secret bestowed upon me by the only man who ever truly understood what it took to build an empire, my grandfather Harrison. Harrison Tisana was the titan who had actually laid the bricks of our family's wealth, starting with a single construction crane in the late 1960s and turning it into the $92 million behemoth that my father was now slowly but surely suffocating with his own short-sightedness. 6 months before Harrison passed away in his sprawling estate in the Berkshires, a stone fortress of a house that overlooked the rolling fog of the Massachusetts hills, he sent for me. He didn't send for Richard, and he certainly didn't send for Julian, whom he privately referred to as a parasite that would eat the host from the inside out. I remember the drive up to the Berkshires in my beat-up sedan, the engine straining against the steep inclines, a stark contrast to the effortless power of the vehicles my father and brother took for granted. When I arrived, the house smelled of a clinical mixture of antiseptic, lavender, and the heavy, dusty scent of old money, the kind of wealth that doesn't need to shout because its silence is a form of gravity. Grandfather Harrison was sitting in a high-backed leather chair by a fireplace that could have roasted an ox, his hands gnarled like the roots of an ancient oak, but his eyes were as sharp and predatory as the day he took over his first rival firm. He looked at me, really looked at me, and he saw the summa cum laude intellect that my father had tried to hide in a guest bathroom. He saw the forensic precision of my mind and the cold fire of my ambition, and he told me that a legacy is not a name. It is a foundation, and you do not build a foundation on sand. In that quiet room, while a 1920s grandfather clock ticked away the seconds with a rhythmic, mechanical finality, Harrison signed a series of documents that effectively bypassed my father's entire generation. It was an irrevocable blind trust, a legal masterpiece of concealment and protection drafted by a firm in the Cayman Islands that charged $2,000 an hour just to answer the phone. The initial amount was $5 million in liquid capital, carved out from a subsidiary my father didn't even realize was profitable. But there was a condition, a masterstroke of genealogical engineering that ensured the money would only ever empower the person Harrison believed was the true heir of his spirit. The trust was to remain dormant, accumulating a guaranteed 6% compound interest, untouched and invisible to the prying eyes of the Tisana Development's auditors, until a very specific trigger was met: the birth of my first female heir. Harrison knew that my father would never let a woman lead, and he knew that Julian would lead the family into a ditch, so he placed the ultimate weapon in my hands, knowing that I would have the discipline to wait for the right moment to strike. For years, I had to play the part of the struggling failure to keep this secret safe from the predatory instincts of my own family. It was a performance of Shakespearean proportions, a decade of intentional mediocrity designed to ensure that my father never grew suspicious enough to dig into the older accounts. I let him believe that I was barely making ends meet in Chicago. I let him think that my degree was a waste of time. And I even let him think that I was desperate when he drained my $50,000 education fund. Every time I felt like screaming, every time the indignity of being the ghost daughter threatened to boil over, I would pull up a compound interest calculator on my encrypted phone. I watched the $5 million grow, with a 6% yield compounded annually, that $5 million was becoming $6, then $7, then $8 million. By the time I was 31, that dormant seed had blossomed into a nearly $9 million war chest, a private fortune that existed entirely outside the reach of the men who thought they owned me. I lived in a studio apartment where the faucet leaked and the neighbors argued through paper-thin walls, all while being one of the wealthiest women of my generation, purely to protect the coming storm. The discipline required to maintain this ruse was grueling, a constant exercise in biting my tongue until it bled. I watched my father buy a black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country for Julian as a reward for merely showing up to work, while I was calculating whether I could afford the $200 repair on my car's alternator. I attended the family holiday dinners where I was sat at the end of the table, ignored and dismissed, listening to Julian brag about his $12,000 watches and his private jet trips to Aspen. I played the role of the quiet, slightly pathetic Elena, the one who didn't understand the business, the one who was just waiting to marry a provider. I did it because I knew that the moment I showed even a glimpse of my true financial power, my father would have moved heaven and earth to litigate it away from me, claiming I had stolen it, or that Harrison was not of sound mind when he signed the papers. But Harrison was the soundest mind I had ever known, and the trust was ironclad, a legal fortress that could withstand a nuclear blast. The birth of a female heir was not just a biological requirement, it was a philosophical statement. Harrison wanted the Tisana strength to pass through the line that had been the most resilient, the line that had been forged in the fire of exclusion. He knew that if I had a daughter, I would raise her to be a lioness in a world that wanted her to be a lamb, and he provided the gold to buy the pride. This secret architecture of revenge was not about getting rich. It was about the total and absolute replacement of my father's corrupt version of our legacy with something pure, something intellectual, and something undeniably feminine. Every cent of that compound interest was a brick in the wall I was building around my future daughter, ensuring that she would never have to experience the $85,000 humiliation of a courtyard where her worth was debated by men with silver-plated microphones. When I finally became pregnant, the reality of the situation began to shift from a long-term plan into an immediate tactical operation. I knew the baby was a girl from the earliest possible blood test, a secret I kept hidden for as long as I could while I prepared the final deletion of my father's access to the family's liquid assets. I spent my nights in Chicago, not at bars or social events, but deep in the digital ledgers of the trust, watching the numbers climb with a cold, clinical satisfaction. I was the architect of their downfall, and I had been building the gallows for 10 years while they thought I was just a ghost in their peripheral vision. My father's $92 million empire was built on debt, ego, and the exploitation of people like me. But my $9 million trust was built on patience, silence, and the iron will of a man who saw the future and decided to bet against his own son. The day my father stood in that courtyard and told the world that the Tisana wealth flows only to male heirs, he was committing a form of financial suicide without even realizing it. He was effectively disowning the very person who held the keys to the only real capital the family had left. He thought he was exerting power, but he was actually just shouting into a void that I had already created. The silver-plated microphone and the 150 guests were just the window dressing for a funeral, a high-priced wake for a dynasty that was already dead in every way that mattered. As I drove away from that estate in my Tesla, the quiet hum of the car was the sound of the future arriving on schedule. I wasn't just a woman with a baby. I was a woman with a mission and the capital to execute it. Grandfather Harrison's signature on those irrevocable documents was the first domino to fall, and I had spent a decade ensuring that every other domino was perfectly aligned to crush my father and Julian under the weight of their own arrogance. The struggle was over. The part of the failure had been played to its conclusion, and the secret was now a reality. My daughter would be born into a world where she owned the bank, where she owned the land, and where the name Tisana meant something entirely different than it did when my father was at the helm. It was a revenge served at the exact right temperature, calculated to the 4th decimal point, and delivered with the surgical precision of a forensic accountant. The $112,000 baby shower was the last bill the old Tisana era would ever pay, and as the interest on my trust continued to compound at 6% every single day, I knew that the true legacy was just beginning. Family is not about who shares your DNA. It is about who has the foresight to protect the future, and Grandfather Harrison had chosen me to be the one to turn the lights out on my father's dark, sexist reign. The secret architecture was complete, and the view from the top of the ruins was going to be magnificent. My name is Elena Tisana, and while my brother Julian was busy playing the role of Vice President of Tisana Developments, a title he wore like a stolen crown while losing precisely $2,400,000 on a spectacularly failed luxury condo project in East Haven, I was busy becoming the invisible architect of my father's eventual ruin. While Julian was posing for regional business magazines in $3,000 Italian suits and making disastrous decisions about premium marble finishes for buildings that would never be completed, I was in Chicago building a firm called Vanguard Horizon from the ground up in a windowless office that smelled of stale coffee and pure, unadulterated ambition. By the time I turned 30, Vanguard Horizon was no longer just a small-scale operation run out of a studio apartment. It was a highly specialized firm managing $15 million in distressed assets, focusing on the very kind of over-leveraged, ego-driven real estate projects that my father had spent his entire life creating. I had spent years living like a pauper, surviving on a $42,000 salary and generic brand groceries, while quietly reinvesting every single penny of my actual earnings and the growth from my grandfather's hidden trust into a sophisticated machine designed for a single purpose: financial reclamation. I began tracking the health of Tisana Developments with the cold, detached precision of a surgeon looking at a terminal X-ray, and what I saw was a company that was not just struggling, but drowning in its own desperate need to maintain the appearance of wealth. My father, Richard, was so terrified of the Greenwich social circle finding out that his empire was crumbling that he began taking out high-interest mezzanine loans from secondary lenders, the kind of predatory debt that carries interest rates as high as 18% and comes with aggressive collateral requirements. He was using the family estate, the very ground I had been humiliated on, as a piggy bank to fund Julian's incompetence, and he was doing it all through a series of increasingly frantic shell companies to hide the bleeding from his primary auditors. I watched through my Bloomberg terminal as the credit rating of Tisana Developments began to flicker and fade, and I saw the opportunity I had been preparing for since the night I drove out of Connecticut with 2 suitcases and a bruised heart. Through a complex network of anonymous shell companies registered in Delaware, entities with names like Silverleaf Capital and Aegis Recovery, I began to quietly and systematically buy up my father's corporate debt from the original lenders who were more than happy to offload the risk of a failing Connecticut developer. I spent 18 months of my life submerged in the minutiae of his loan agreements, identifying the exact clauses that would allow a creditor to seize control of the underlying assets in the event of a technical default. By the time the process was complete, I had spent $8,200,000 to acquire the senior debt positions on my father's most prized commercial properties. including the headquarters of Tisana Developments itself and the very land that the East Haven condo project was supposed to sit on. My father believed he was dealing with a faceless institutional bank located in a glass tower in Wilmington, a nameless entity that would be satisfied with interest payments and occasional extensions. He had no idea that every time he signed a document to restructure his debt, he was placing his neck further into a noose held by the daughter he had dismissed as a decorative overhead expense. I remember sitting in my Chicago office, staring at the digital signatures on the most recent $500,000 bridge loan, seeing his arrogant, sweeping cursive, and knowing that he was essentially signing over his life's work to the girl whose diploma he had hung in a guest bathroom. The irony was as thick as the Connecticut humidity. He was mortgaging the future of the male heirs he prized so much to a woman who had already outmaneuvered him in every significant metric of financial intelligence. I lived in the data, spending my nights analyzing the cash flow projections of his properties and realizing that he was barely covering the interest on the loans I now owned. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own making, and I was the tide coming in. Julian, meanwhile, was still charging $12,000 weekend trips to the company's line of credit, unaware that the line was now being monitored by my team of forensic accountants at Vanguard Horizon. I saw every dinner at the Stanwich Club, every round of golf at Round Hill, and every designer gift he bought for the women he used to bolster his fragile ego, and I categorized each one as an unauthorized distribution of capital that brought the default date closer. My father thought he was a master of the universe, but he was actually just a tenant in a house I was systematically repossessing. I had become the shadow creditor, the ghost in his ledger, and the person who finally understood that the only way to truly destroy a man like Richard Tisana was not through a public scandal, but through the quiet, methodical removal of his capital. The transition from a victim of his sexism to the owner of his debt was a transformation that required a level of emotional discipline that most people cannot comprehend. I had to listen to my mother call me and complain about how hard my father was working and how Julian was just under so much pressure to carry the family name, all while I was looking at the default notices I was preparing to send to their lawyers. I had to maintain the facade of the struggling, distant daughter during the few holidays I couldn't avoid, sitting at the far end of the table while Julian bragged about his black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country, knowing that the title for that vehicle was technically tied to the corporate assets I was about to seize. I felt no guilt, only a sense of profound mathematical inevitability. They had taught me that I was worth nothing, and I had taken that lesson and turned it into an $8 million weapon. My father's $92 million empire was now a house of cards, and I was the wind. I remember one specific evening in Chicago, the rain lashing against the windows of my office as I finalized the acquisition of the final $3 million of his unsecured debt. The total cost of the project had reached $8.2 million, a sum that represented nearly every cent of the liquid capital I had painstakingly built up from my grandfather's trust and the profits of Vanguard Horizon. I was all in. I was betting my entire future on the fact that my father and brother were too arrogant to see the trap until it was too late to escape. I looked at the spreadsheet that detailed the cross-collateralization of the Tisana family assets, seeing how the estate in Greenwich was now legally linked to the performance of the failed East Haven condos. If one fell, they all fell. It was a beautiful, terrifying piece of financial engineering that ensured the total collapse of the Tisana name as a symbol of power. I was not just reclaiming the $50,000 he had stolen from me, I was reclaiming the dignity of every woman who had ever been told they were secondary in the history of that family. My father's business model was based on the past, on handshakes and heritage, and the belief that the world owed him success because of his gender and his zip code. My business model was based on the future, on data and leverage and the cold reality of a balance sheet that doesn't care about your last name. He was dealing with a faceless bank, but he was actually dealing with the daughter who had spent 10 years learning how to speak the language of money better than he ever could. He thought he was a lion, but he was just a tethered goat, and I was the one who had tied the knot. As I sat in the darkness of my office, the only light coming from the 3 glowing monitors displaying the wreckage of his company, I felt a sense of peace. The $112,000 baby shower was still months away, but the outcome was already decided. The math was finished. The debt was mine. And the daughter who was once considered overhead was now the only person who could decide whether or not Richard Tisana would have a roof over his head by the end of the year. The secret architecture of my revenge had moved from the shadows of a Berkshire estate into the high-rise offices of Chicago, and the shadow creditor was ready to step into the light. I had spent my life being told that I was a passenger in the Tisana story, a secondary character destined to be a footnote in Julian's biography, but I had rewritten the ending in a language of debt and interest rates. My name is Elena Tisana, and I am the owner of my father's mistakes, the holder of his debt, and the woman who finally understood that in the world of high finance, the person who holds the paper holds the power. By the time I returned to Connecticut for that final, humiliating afternoon in the courtyard, I wasn't just a guest. I was the landlord of their entire existence. I had built Vanguard Horizon to be a fortress, and I had used that fortress to lay siege to the very people who thought they had left me with nothing. The $8.2 million was more than just an investment. It was my Declaration of Independence, signed in the blood of a dying dynasty and delivered with the cold, silent efficiency of a woman who had finally learned that the best way to get even is to own the very air your enemies breathe. The debt was called, the interest was due, and the daughter they had erased was the only one who could sign the receipt for their total and absolute surrender. My name is Elena Tisana, and as the pink confetti from the twin reveal continued to settle like a layer of silent, vibrant snow over the manicured grounds of the Greenwich estate, I watched the structural integrity of my father's reality dissolve in real time. The 150 guests stood frozen, their $12 glasses of Chardonnay suspended in mid-air, as I stepped fully into the role I had spent 10 years preparing to play. My father, Richard, was still gasping for air, his face a mottled shade of purple that clashed horribly with the pink silk petals clinging to his navy blazer. But I did not give him a single second to recover his footing or craft a lie. I spoke directly into the vacuum of his silence, my voice projecting with a clarity that didn't need the silver-plated microphone he was still clutching like a useless relic of a dead era. I informed him, and every socialite, senator, and CEO in attendance that Grandfather Harrison had not been the fool Richard took him for, that 6 months before he passed, he had established an irrevocable blind trust in the amount of $5 million, specifically earmarked for the very female heirs my father had just disowned in front of the entire world. I watched his eyes bulge as the math began to settle in his mind. The $5 million principal, compounded at 6% annually for nearly a decade, had created a fortune that made his own dwindling liquid assets look like pocket change. But I wasn't finished with the revelation of the trust. That was merely the shield I was using to protect my daughters, while the sword was what I drew next from the 12-page notarized document in my hand. I leaned in closer to him, the scent of his expensive scotch and desperate sweat filling the small space between us, and I told him the truth about the empire he thought he still ruled. I reminded him that Tisana Developments had been drowning for 18 months, and that in his arrogance, he had missed exactly 3 consecutive quarterly payments on the high-interest bridge loans he had taken out to fund Julian's catastrophic failures in East Haven. I saw the moment the name of my firm, Vanguard Horizon, finally registered in his brain, the faceless, Delaware-based entity that had been quietly absorbing his debt since May. I announced to the crowd that I was no longer just the daughter he considered an overhead expense. I was officially his primary creditor, the holder of his notes, and the person who now controlled the destiny of every brick and board of the Tisana legacy. The silence in the courtyard was so absolute that when my father finally dropped his crystal glass, the sound of it shattering against the $85,000 Italian flagstone sounded like a gunshot marking the end of a dynasty. The shards of glass glittered in the sun, mirroring the cold triumph in my own eyes as I reached back into my bag and pulled out a separate, brightly colored envelope that contained a legal document with a much darker purpose. It was a formal foreclosure notice, served with the surgical precision of a woman who had spent years learning how to dismantle a balance sheet. I handed it to him, the heavy paper crinkling in his shaking hand, and I told him that this very house, the Georgian colonial that served as the monument to his ego, was now collateral that I was officially repossessing. The guests watched in a state of collective shock as the great patriarch of Greenwich read the words that effectively made him a trespasser on his own lawn. Behind him, my brother Julian, whose face had transitioned from a smirk to a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror, tried to step forward and intervene, his voice cracking as he began to stammer something about family loyalty and how we could work this out privately. I didn't even let him finish the sentence. Instead, I turned my gaze toward him, my eyes landing on the $18,000 Rolex Submariner that sat so comfortably on his wrist. I told Julian, with a coldness that seemed to drop the temperature of the entire courtyard, that the watch was no longer his personal property. Since it had been purchased with a corporate credit line that was currently in default, and since I now held the lien on all corporate assets of Tisana Developments, that timepiece was technically my property. I told him to hand it over, right there in front of the people he had spent his life trying to impress with his borrowed status. The humiliation was total and absolute, a mirror image of the way they had treated me for 31 years, but with the added weight of legal finality. Julian looked at my father, seeking a rescue that was never going to come, and then back at me, realizing for the first time that the sister he had laughed at was the person who now owned the very air he breathed. He slowly unclasped the silver band, his hands trembling so violently that he almost dropped it, and placed the heavy watch into my open palm. It felt cold and hollow, a fitting symbol for the hollow man who had worn it. I stood there, the primary creditor of a $92 million empire, holding my brother's watch in one hand and my father's foreclosure notice in the other. And I felt the weight of 10 years of Chicago winters and $42,000 salaries finally lift from my shoulders. The total liquidation was not just about the money or the real estate. It was about the absolute removal of their ability to ever hurt another woman in the name of the Tisana legacy. I informed my father that he had exactly 30 days to vacate the premises and that my forensic accountants would be arriving on Monday morning to begin a full audit of every cent that had been moved through the company accounts over the last decade. I saw my mother in the periphery, her hand over her mouth, but I also saw her start to back away from my father, her survival instincts finally overriding her social conditioning. She knew, as they all did, that the center of power had shifted irrevocably and that the ghost daughter was now the only person in the room with the capital to stay standing. The guests began to filter out of the courtyard, their hushed whispers creating a low hum of gossip that would be the lead story in every Greenwich country club by sunset. They didn't offer my father their condolences. They moved away from him as if his failure were contagious, gravitating instead toward the edge of the courtyard where I stood, the new architect of the family's future. I watched them go, realizing that these people were never friends of my father's. They were merely spectators to his wealth, and now they were the witnesses to his poverty. I looked down at the 12-page document, the gold seal still shimmering, and thought about the $112,000 he had spent on this afternoon. It was the most expensive mistake of his life, a party he had thrown to celebrate a male heir that didn't exist, using money he didn't have, in a house he no longer owned. The irony was a masterclass in poetic justice, a mathematical proof that arrogance is the most expensive luxury a man can afford. My father finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a ragged whisper, asking me how I could do this to my own blood. I looked him in the eye and reminded him that he was the one who taught me about blood. He was the one who said the wealth only flows to male heirs and that women were just vessels for other people's legacies. I told him that I was simply following his own logic to its natural conclusion. Since I was not a male heir, I had to become the owner, and since Julian was a failure, he was a liability that had to be liquidated. I was not being a daughter. I was being a businesswoman, the very thing he had told me I could never be. I was the personification of every cent he had overlooked and every degree he had hidden in a bathroom. And now I was the person who was going to decide exactly how much his pride was worth on the open market. I turned away from the ruins of his ego and began to walk toward the gate where my Tesla was parked. The quiet, electric humming of the car, a stark contrast to the shattered glass and the broken silence of the estate. I didn't look back at the black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe that I would be repossessing on Monday, and I didn't look back at the man who was currently sitting in a folding chair, surrounded by pink confetti and the wreckage of his life. I was 31 years old, 7 months pregnant with twin girls, and I had just completed the most successful hostile takeover in the history of the Tisana name. The total liquidation was complete, the debts were settled, and the future was finally, undeniably mine. As I drove away from the $92 million Colonial, I felt the babies move, a double kick of life that felt like a standing ovation for the world I had built for them. My name is Elena Tisana, and I am the woman who proved that while men might build empires on names, daughters build them on the truth, and the truth always has the final word on the balance sheet. The Tisana legacy was dead, but the reign of the female heirs had just begun, and it was funded by the very man who tried to tell them they didn't exist. By the time the sun set over the Long Island Sound, the house would be quiet, the scotch would be warm, and the only thing left of my father's reign would be the pink petals blowing across a courtyard that no longer belonged to him. My name is Elena Tisana, and today the math of my life has finally reached a state of perfect crystalline equilibrium where the debts of the past have been settled and the future is a sprawling, unblemished landscape of my own design. The dust has long since settled on that $85,000 courtyard in Greenwich, and the pink confetti has been swept away, leaving behind a reality that my father, Richard, could never have predicted in his darkest, most whiskey-soaked nightmares. It is a quiet Tuesday morning in my corner office on the 44th floor of the Vanguard Horizon Tower, a glass and steel monolith that pierces the Chicago skyline, and as I look out over the gray expanse of Lake Michigan, I think about the 2 lives I have systematically dismantled to build a fortress for the 2 lives I am currently raising. My father, the man who once presided over a $92 million empire with the casual cruelty of a king, now lives in a 900-square-foot rental apartment in a part of Stamford he used to mock as a landing pad for the mediocre and the forgotten. His view is no longer of the Long Island Sound and manicured boxwood hedges. Instead, he looks out at a communal parking lot and a laundromat, a cramped space where the walls are thin enough for him to hear the lives of the neighbors he once considered beneath his notice. He spends his days navigating the bureaucratic labyrinths of Medicare and trying to stretch a Social Security check that barely covers the cost of the high-end scotch he still insists on drinking, a bitter reminder of a lifestyle that was repossessed along with his dignity. The transition for Julian was perhaps even more jarring, a descent from the heights of unearned luxury into the cold, hard pavement of the real world that he was never equipped to handle. My brother, the golden boy who once crashed a $140,000 Porsche only to have it replaced by Monday morning, is now working as a junior leasing agent for a mid-market residential firm, earning exactly $19 an hour. He spends his afternoons showing studio apartments to people who have more ambition in their pinky fingers than he has in his entire body, carrying a plastic clipboard and wearing a suit that I know is a polyester blend because I can see the cheap sheen of it in the background of the few social media posts he still dares to make. He no longer checks an $18,000 Rolex to see how much time he has left before a yacht party. He checks a basic digital watch to ensure he isn't late for a shift that barely pays for his gas and his shared cellular plan. The black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe High Country that he treated as a birthright was sold at a liquidation auction months ago, the proceeds going directly into the educational fund for the nieces he chose to ignore in favor of his own ego. He is learning, for the first time in his 34 years, what it actually means to be overhead, to be a replaceable part in a machine that doesn't care about your surname or the school you barely graduated from. While they are submerged in the consequences of their own arrogance, my life has become a masterclass in purposeful growth and generational protection, a direct refutation of the sexist legacy they tried to force upon me. My twin girls, who are now toddlers with my grandfather Harrison's sharp eyes and a fierce, independent spirit that I nurture every single day, have a $5 million head start that has already grown significantly through the same 6% compound interest that funded my revolution. They are not growing up in a house where their worth is debated or where their achievements are hidden in a guest bathroom behind a closed door. They live in a world where their mother owns the very skyscraper they visit on the weekends, a place where they see women leading board meetings and managing billions in assets with the same precision I used to take down their grandfather's house of cards. I am raising them to understand that money is not just a tool for consumption, but a form of armor and a means of agency, ensuring that no man will ever be able to stand behind a silver-plated microphone and tell them that they are secondary to a male heir who hasn't even been born. The final act of my departure from the Tisana shadow was not a shouting match or a dramatic confrontation, but a single clinical email that I sent to my father exactly 6 months after the foreclosure was finalized. It was a cold 12-page PDF containing the final liquidation stats of his former life, a detailed ledger showing exactly how much each of his mistakes had cost and how I had converted his failures into my successes. I included the sale price of the Greenwich estate, the repossession records of the family vehicles, and the final balance of the trust fund that he had tried to claim was a vanity project. I wanted him to see the math one last time, to understand that his downfall wasn't an act of God or a stroke of bad luck, but a calculated result of his own decision to bet against the most capable person in his bloodline. I didn't wait for a reply, and I didn't leave an opening for an apology that I knew would be hollow and self-serving. As soon as the status bar on my screen showed that the message had been delivered, I clicked the block button on his number and his email address, severing the last digital thread of a relationship that had only ever been a burden. I didn't feel anger, and I didn't feel a sense of traditional revenge. I felt the profound, quiet relief of a clean slate, the kind of peace that only comes when you finally stop trying to earn the respect of people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it. The skyscraper I own is built on the ruins of their pride, but its foundations are made of the 10 years I spent in the Chicago shadows, the nights I spent studying forensic accounting while my father was at the country club, and the relentless discipline I maintained while living on a $42,000 salary. I have proven that the Tisana name does not belong to the men who squandered it, but to the daughter who had the foresight to save it by destroying its most corrupt elements. When I walk through the lobby of my building, the security guards don't nod to me because of who my father was. They nod to me because of who I am and what I have built with my own hands and my own mind. My daughters will grow up knowing that their mother took over the whole board, not by playing the game their grandfather designed, but by writing a new set of rules in a language he was too arrogant to learn. They are the true heirs of Harrison's spirit, the beneficiaries of a secret architecture that was designed to wait for them, and they will never know the weight of a slap or the sting of a public humiliation. I think back to the girl who drove away from Connecticut in a used car with 2 suitcases and $1,200 in her pocket, and I wish I could tell her that the road she was taking was going to lead exactly where she needed to go. I would tell her that every generic bag of rice, every clanking radiator, and every hour spent in a windowless office was a down payment on a level of freedom that most people never achieve. I would tell her that the silence her family gave her was the greatest gift they ever provided, because it gave her the cover to become the shadow creditor who would eventually step into the light. The math of my life is no longer about survival. It is about legacy, a word that finally means something of value. My name is Elena Tisana, and I am the woman who deleted the future of the men who tried to put me in my place, only to find that my place was at the head of the table they no longer have a seat at. The board is clear, the pieces are mine, and for the first time in 31 years, the only voice I have to listen to is my own, echoing through the halls of a life that is entirely, beautifully, and legally my own. Family is not the blood you share, but the boundaries you set and the people you choose to protect with the strength you've forged in the fire of their neglect. I have built a world where pink confetti is not a sign of disappointment, but a banner of victory, and where the presence of a female heir is the ultimate mark of success. My father can keep his 900-square-foot memories and his $12 whiskey, and Julian can keep his $19 an hour lessons in humility. I have the skyscraper, I have the girls, and I have the absolute certainty that I am exactly who I was always meant to be. The clean slate is the most beautiful thing I have ever looked at, a white expanse of possibility where the only ink that matters is the kind that signs the checks and the documents that guarantee my daughters will never have to fight the battles I've already won for them. The story of the Tisana men is a cautionary tale of how to lose everything through the blind pursuit of a sexist past. But my story is a blueprint for how to win everything through the quiet, relentless pursuit of a realistic and emotional future. I am done being a ghost, I am done being overhead, and I am finally, undeniably, the master of the board. The liquidation is complete, the accounts are closed, and I am walking into the sunlight of a day that belongs to no one but me.